Hidden beneath centuries of doctrine, ritual, and cultural evolution, there are practices that once shaped spiritual life so deeply that later generations felt compelled to bury them. These practices were neither legends nor fringe customs. They were documented in temple records, preserved in monastic journals, and whispered about by early chroniclers who sensed that certain forms of knowledge were simply too powerful to survive unchanged. As religions spread across continents, absorbing new cultures and redefining their identities, some of these traditions were deliberately suppressed, not because they lacked meaning, but because they granted individuals a level of influence once reserved for priests, prophets, and elders. Their disappearance from the public eye was not accidental. It was strategic, reflecting a desire to maintain order, protect communities, and control the unpredictable forces that these rituals were believed to awaken. The first of these practices appears in early manuscripts from desert communities where spiritual authority was closely tied to the guardianship of sacred texts. Within these texts lies a method known among historians as the thread invocation, a ritual that used knots, sequences, and whispered recitations to bind intentions into physical objects. The ritual was believed to direct outcomes in ways that modern observers might describe as symbolic psychology, though earlier practitioners treated it as a direct conduit for spiritual influence. Merchants used it before long caravans, families used it to protect their homes, and healers used it to focus energy toward recovering patients. Over time, however, its widespread use drew concern from religious leaders who feared that ordinary individuals were gaining access to a form of influence that bypassed established spiritual hierarchies. The ritual gradually disappeared from common practice, mentioned only briefly in later commentaries as something once used by the untrained, but no longer endorsed. What makes this practice particularly intriguing is how thoroughly it vanished despite its deep cultural roots. During excavations of remote settlements, archaeologists found bundles of ancient threads buried beneath sand floors, each tied in deliberate patterns matching descriptions from early texts. Some bundles contained small inscriptions carrying personal names, suggesting that the ritual served not only as protection but as a record of emotions and intentions preserved through symbolic action. While no modern community practices the thread invocation in its original form, some scholars believe echoes of it persist today in familiar customs, tying ribbons for safe journeys, knotting cords at weddings, or creating protective amulets using woven materials. These remnants suggest that although the ritual was formally discouraged, its essence survived through cultural memory, reshaped into forms that felt less threatening to religious authorities while preserving the comfort it once provided. Another practice that quietly slipped beneath the surface involves a technique of silent observation once used by isolated monastic groups seeking heightened spiritual sensitivity. Early chronicles describe practitioners who spent nights in absolute stillness, focusing not on prayer but on the subtle shifts of their surroundings. They believed that silence itself was a medium through which spiritual messages could be interpreted, a discipline that required patience, detachment, and a willingness to confront whatever surfaced in the mind. Through this method, some claimed to perceive insights about approaching storms, emotional unrest in nearby communities, or changes in leadership long before they occurred. Such accounts have led some modern scholars to interpret the practice as an advanced form of meditation tied to environmental awareness, though the writings emphasize that practitioners viewed their experiences as revelations rather than observations. Over time, this discipline raised concerns among religious leaders because it blurred the line between personal revelation and doctrinal authority. If individuals could access insight without sanctioned rituals or established texts, institutions risked losing their central role in guiding believers. Gradually, the practice was reframed as unnecessary, then discouraged, and finally classified as a distraction from proper prayer. The last references to its formal use appear in scattered entries from wandering scribes who noted that only a handful of elders still preserved the technique, passing it on quietly without expectation that it would survive another generation. Yet its influence lives on through modern contemplative practices that emphasize breath, silence, and presence, remnants that carry the faint outline of a discipline once considered too powerful to remain accessible to the public. These early practices reveal a pattern repeated across many regions and eras. The rituals that faded were not abandoned out of disinterest but intentionally guided into obscurity because of the autonomy they granted ordinary practitioners. Their disappearance reflects a tension between personal spiritual power and institutional structure, a balance that shaped the evolution of countless belief systems. As we explore further remnants of forbidden traditions still hiding within modern religion, each fragment offers a glimpse of a world where spiritual influence was once far more personal, fluid, and accessible than most contemporary followers realize. Among the traditions that receded into silence, one of the most delicate and least understood involves a practice historians now call the ember exchange. It originated in mountain villages where spiritual life revolved around communal hearths believed to hold the memory of ancestors. During seasonal transitions, families gathered embers from the central hearth, carried them home in small clay vessels, and performed a quiet ritual meant to transfer balance from the community to the household. The ritual called for a specific sequence: lifting the ember with a carved wooden spoon, passing it between family members, and placing it onto a fresh bed of ash while murmuring a phrase found repeatedly in early local manuscripts. Villagers believed that the ember carried not only physical warmth but the symbolic harmony of the entire community, anchoring the home during times of uncertainty. What drew scrutiny from religious authorities was not the act itself but the meaning attributed to it. Outsiders feared the ritual created a parallel system of spiritual authority that did not align with formal teachings. The ember exchange suggested that divine balance could be distributed in small, personal fragments, allowing ordinary families to access a form of guidance without relying on sanctioned intermediaries. Records from regional councils show repeated attempts to regulate or reinterpret the ritual, framing it as a cultural custom rather than a source of spiritual influence. Over time, the symbolic language surrounding the practice was stripped away. The wooden spoons were replaced by metal tools, the clay vessels discarded, and the whispered phrase forgotten or reimagined as a simple household blessing. Today, the practice survives only as a tradition of lighting new fires from communal sources during festivals, the deeper intention erased from collective memory. The fourth forbidden practice lies deeper in historical records and is the one that modern researchers approach with the greatest caution. It involves a technique used by early mystics who believed that intuition could be deliberately sharpened through a controlled state between waking and dreaming. This state, described in fragmented manuscripts, was induced through rhythmic breathing and exposure to dim, shifting light, often produced by a single lantern slowly rotated by hand. Practitioners claimed that in this liminal state they could perceive symbolism, resolve conflicts, and anticipate dangers with startling clarity. Unlike prophetic traditions tied to visions or trance, this practice relied on the disciplined use of the boundary between sleep and wakefulness, treating the subconscious as a tool rather than a mystery. Religious leaders eventually declared this technique forbidden, citing its potential to produce insights that conflicted with doctrine or undermined established systems of interpretation. Several manuscripts describe individuals who grew dependent on the practice, seeking answers to every decision until they struggled to distinguish intuition from imagination. Others began interpreting the shifting light as messages of spiritual significance, creating tension within communities that relied on structured guidance. As a result, the use of dim light induction was quietly suppressed, its tools confiscated, and its methods reclassified as superstition rather than sanctioned contemplation. Only scattered references survived: a list of breathing patterns in a monk's journal, a partially burned lantern with symbols carved around its handle, and a commentary by a scribe warning that certain knowledge expands faster than the mind can anchor. Contemporary researchers note that echoes of this forbidden technique persist in modern practices involving visualization, guided meditation, and dream interpretation, though without the strict discipline that defined its original form. The technique's disappearance suggests that its power was not symbolic but psychological, offering practitioners a way to access deeper layers of perception that religious institutions were not prepared to integrate into mainstream teaching. Whether seen as an early exploration of consciousness or a spiritual method too unstable to manage, it stands as one of the earliest documented cases where personal insight threatened institutional order. These four practices form a pattern that becomes clearer with each surviving manuscript. They were not hidden because they were evil or dangerous in a moral sense, but because they expanded spiritual agency beyond formal structures. They offered direct access to intention, perception, harmony, and intuition, concepts that today remain central to many modern disciplines but once existed as carefully guarded tools of sacred life. Their stories remind us that religion is not only shaped by what is preserved, but by what is allowed to fade, leaving behind quiet traces of a much older and more fluid spiritual landscape that once thrived beneath the surface of organized tradition. As scholars map the disappearance of these practices across continents, a deeper pattern begins to surface, one that reveals how spiritual systems evolved by intentionally narrowing the pathways through which individuals could interpret the sacred. Each forbidden practice involved personal agency, the ability to influence one's environment, interpret signs independently, or cultivate heightened awareness without relying on sanctioned rituals. And as religious institutions grew in size and authority, anything that allowed individuals to operate outside the approved framework gradually shifted into silence. Yet the practices never vanished entirely. Their remnants persisted through symbolism, folk customs, and the hidden habits of small communities that continued them in reduced or disguised forms. These fragments, scattered across oral traditions and overlooked artifacts, create a subtle map of spiritual resilience that historians are only now beginning to understand. In one remote coastal region, researchers found evidence of a practice that blends elements of all four forbidden traditions. Elders described an old custom where families gathered near the shoreline during seasonal tides, lighting lanterns in a deliberate rhythm while tying thin strands of dried grass into knots. According to local accounts, this ritual once helped fishermen interpret the sea's temperament, guiding decisions about when to sail or when to remain ashore. The practice incorporated the ember exchange's idea of communal balance, the thread invocations' knots of intention, and the dim light induction's shifting radiance. But by the time researchers documented it, the ritual had already been stripped of its original meaning. It was performed only during festivals, framed as a cultural performance rather than a tool of insight. Elders admitted that their grandparents had spoken of the ritual's real use, but those teachings had been discouraged, then forgotten, leaving only the shell of what once served as a spiritual compass for entire villages. This fading of meaning mirrors transitions documented in dozens of regions. Practices once rooted in survival, reflection, and deep connection to the natural world were slowly reinterpreted as symbolic gestures, harmless traditions that posed no challenge to institutional authority. A similar transformation occurred in mountain monasteries where practitioners once used controlled silence to interpret environmental cues. Over centuries, the discipline was reduced to a mere posture of contemplation, its deeper purpose dissolved into general meditation practices. What remains today are peaceful gatherings and quiet rooms, practices beneficial in their own right but far removed from the original method, which once trained individuals to sense subtle shifts in weather, mood, and impending conflict with remarkable accuracy. Modern practitioners experience calm, but not revelation, focus, but not foresight. An even more striking example comes from a once prominent city where temple authorities maintained detailed logs of rituals used to balance the emotional field of large gatherings. This ritual involved coordinated breathing, synchronized lantern movement, and a moment of collective stillness. The practice was believed to align the community's intentions, easing tensions before major decisions. But because it empowered crowds rather than leaders, its use was gradually restricted, then reframed as a meditative exercise with no spiritual implication. Centuries later, only the outward structure survived as part of a festival dance, its meaning replaced with mythic symbolism unrelated to its original function. The transformation illustrates how rituals can be preserved yet rendered harmless, kept alive in form but stripped of the very power that once defined them. These gradual shifts raise a profound question. What was lost when these practices faded? Many scholars argue that their disappearance narrowed the range of spiritual experiences available to communities. Instead of engaging directly with intuition, balance, and symbolic action, individuals became increasingly dependent on external authority for interpretation. This transition may have offered stability, but it also diluted personal connection to the sacred, reducing spirituality to a set of prescribed pathways rather than an expansive field of exploration. The forbidden practices remind us that early spiritual life was far more dynamic and participatory, defined as much by personal discovery as by collective belief. Yet the most compelling aspect of these forgotten traditions is their persistence at the edges of modern religion. While the original practices cannot be fully recovered, echoes of them remain visible in rituals of protection, meditative techniques, communal blessings, and symbolic acts performed during life transitions. These remnants serve as faint reminders of a spiritual landscape that once encouraged individuals to observe, interpret, and engage with unseen forces in deeply personal ways. And although they no longer carry the influence they once held, their surviving fragments suggest that the human desire for direct spiritual connection never truly disappears. It simply adapts, waiting quietly beneath the surface for those who know how to recognize it. As historians continue piecing together these fragments, a clearer picture emerges of why these practices slipped beneath the surface rather than vanishing entirely. They belong to an era when spirituality operated through direct experience, where individuals interpreted signs, shaped intention with their hands, and understood silence as a living medium instead of an empty one. The rituals offered pathways to insight that required no temples, no intermediaries, and no formal hierarchy, only discipline and quiet awareness. As institutional structures grew, these personal channels became difficult to regulate. Suppressing them was not simply an attempt to remove danger, but an effort to standardize how communities understood the sacred. The result was a slow, deliberate transformation in which powerful customs were softened into symbols, then folded into folklore, until only faint echoes remained. Yet even in their diminished forms, these echoes continue to influence modern spiritual behavior. The thread invocation survives in the instinct to tie protective ribbons around loved ones or to keep symbolic tokens in pockets before journeys. The ember exchange lingers in traditions of carrying flame from communal fires during celebrations. The dim light induction reappears in forms of guided meditation that immerse practitioners in shifting imagery, even without realizing the connection. And the silent observation practiced by early monastics reveals itself in the growing popularity of contemplative retreats, where individuals search for clarity in quiet spaces shaped more by intention than doctrine. These modern expressions may lack the precision of their ancient origins, but they reveal how the human instinct for direct spiritual participation persists despite centuries of suppression. What remains most striking is how these forbidden practices highlight a universal truth about belief systems. Spiritual knowledge never disappears completely. It adapts. It disperses. It hides in gestures, sayings, and customs passed down without explanation. And occasionally, it reemerges in subtle moments, when someone acts on intuition they cannot explain, when a symbolic action provides unexpected comfort, or when a quiet moment reveals insights that no formal teaching prepared them to understand. These moments suggest that the boundary between sanctioned ritual and forgotten tradition is far more permeable than history records. Today, scholars recognize that the survival of these practices in diluted form serves a purpose. They offer a reminder that spiritual authority has always been shaped by tension between institutional order and personal experience. By studying these forbidden rituals, we catch a glimpse of a world where spirituality was not confined to designated spaces but woven into daily life, accessible to anyone who knew how to listen, observe, or act with intention. And although the original forms are unlikely to return, their legacy endures quietly, inviting modern seekers to look beyond prescribed patterns and rediscover the subtle, resilient ways in which the sacred continues to speak.